You so much, Adam, for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all the students that have joined, as well as the growing number of audience that are still coming in. I am very pleased to be doing this. I have sort of intentionally stayed away from addressing the Syria question after about 8 years of constant speaking on Syria, to the point where when my wife partner was reading some of what I wrote for this event, she's like, "You've been saying the same thing for 10 years." And I'm like, yeah, I can't make up facts. And the fact that I'm saying the same thing, even after things have sort of transpired and unfolded for me, is a good thing, because I was trying to be as careful and meticulous as I could during the uprising, so as not to overstate or undermine what I am observing. So I am happy to address you and address the topic of what is essentially a broad overview that resembles the topic of my book, Understanding the Syrian Calamity, because it is a calamity. And the subtitle of the book itself is Regime, Opposition, Outsiders. The subtitle of this particular talk is Roots, Dynamics, and Transformation of the Uprising, which actually puts me at a somewhat of a disadvantage, largely because I overplayed my hand, and I'm now realizing that to talk about the roots, dynamics, and transformation of the uprising requires several hours, but I will do as much as I can to summarize, and I might be skipping over some of the material. I'll be speaking for about 35 minutes or so, and I will be reading so that I don't go over time. So thanks again to Adam, to Duke, to Julie, and everybody that has all the unknown soldiers that played a part in this. Thanks to your students, my students, and people that are joining us online. So I'll start by talking about a little bit about Syria today, which is a very grim outlook. And then I'll address the question of roots and dynamics and transformation. And I will leave quite a bit of time for discussion. As many of you might know, or might probably not know, and I say might not know because we are living in a situation where Syria news is no longer on the news. Just like Iran news today is on the news, there will come a time, even though Syria or Iran, sorry, will still be bubbling and boiling, it will begin dissipating. The only thing that will continue to be advertised and discussed and tweeted and addressed on television and on YouTube and elsewhere is the funeral of the Queen's death. Anyway, at this point, let me just say that we are witnessing in Syria one of the most dire contexts in Syrian history, and that goes for many modern history, for many decades, politically, economically, socially, and institutionally, whether it is the thoroughly decrepit infrastructure, the trauma that beset almost all Syrians, notably children, the plight of the internally displaced, as well as that of Syrian refugees elsewhere who must now face a tougher world that has either forgotten Syria altogether or is frustrated by the burden of its refugees, or whether it is the successive and rising health epidemic or epidemics that have been taking place, not least the recent spread of cholera amid the near complete absence of preventative healthcare system, especially in remote areas. All these developments have made Syria miserable and perhaps unlivable for so many. Perhaps some of these developments seem natural, including the drought, for instance, that beset Syria during the first decade of the century. But upon any closer examination, whether it's the drought or other so-called natural developments, disasters, upon closer examination, we learned that the regime's mismanagement of nearly all these crises is at the heart of broader dire outcomes we witness. This much I shared in my first volume on Syria regarding economic failures and social polarization, which inevitably set the background to mass protests. Even then, after the eruption of these protests, Let there be no doubt that while not all ills and crimes and deaths were caused by the Syrian regime in the last 11 years or so, the regime holds the sole responsibility for this state of affairs that has beset Syria, starting not in 2011, but decades prior. Nonetheless, it is it is almost impossible to fully grasp the nature and depth of the Syrian uprising without taking stock of how it was transformed both by Syria's pivotal position in the region and by the correlate intervention of external actors on all sides, transformed from one thing to another. And that is one of the discussions I'll be having today. Even today, after some stabilization, we continue to witness in Syria the effect of a decrepit regime that is holding on to what is left of Syria by sheer force, not governance, management, or even bargaining. The cessation of all-out conflict during the past few years has done little to jumpstart rebuilding of any sort or jumpstart life itself. This is not a grim portrayal. It is Syria's reality today. So much so that supporters of the regime during the conflict are now openly and consistently speaking out about far more than the dire conditions in Syria. Many among these former supporters or potentially existing supporters hold the regime itself responsible for this state of affairs privately and publicly, not least in reference to their dashed hopes that life might still be better under this regime compared to its alternative during the conflict. Things might have or must have changed because these same people who were weary of supporting the uprising, even if they did not like the regime, are now outrightly criticizing the regime to the extent possible in a place like Syria. This is not a simple detail, as I'll share in my closing comments. It has profound implications for the future of Syria and the future of opposition and mobilization, as well as struggle for a dignified existence. A future that one would like to think that might bring together a broader opposition and one that is not abridged by the fiat of external sponsors of the opposition, for instance, as what happened in 2011 and after. Today, I'll be addressing in short order the roots, dynamics, and transformation of the uprising under the title, Understanding the Syrian Calamity. But as I shared, I will be trying to navigate the time so that we can be done in time within about 35, maximum 40 minutes. This is the preliminary title of my current book, as I shared, where I address the uprising directly, but the intention is broader in the book, that is, both in time and space. I intend in the book to address the longer trajectory of Syria's political history that resulted in the current calamitous state of affairs. The writing was always on the wall. It was just a matter of when will the chicken come home to roost. I'll start with a broad overview of the roots of the uprising in Syria, not the causes, for methodological reasons. And that is, many researchers, including myself, avoid the word cause and causes in the context of, especially in the context of revolution. True, none of us predicted the correct timing of the uprising in Syria, let alone the Arab uprisings altogether. But any follower of the political, economic, and institutional affairs in Syria during the 2 decades prior to the eruption of the uprising could observe the construction of a house of cards in Syria, fueled by increased neoliberal-like social and economic policies, a perennially weakened institutional setting, and a dramatic increase in social polarization in a context that was bereft of legitimate avenues for resistance or even protest. So while the social and economic plight of most Syrians worsened during the decade prior to the uprising, despite the regime's efforts to project an image of modernization and youth involvement, what remained constant throughout the decades since the Ba'ath Party's accession to power in 1963 was the ubiquitously repressive political atmosphere. This constant, by definition, did not change. What changed were the meager benefits, social, economic, institutional, provided to the majority of the population, ones that seemed to support what I call a leveling egalitarianism that is at heart repressive in all cases. But the systemic analysis of roots of the Syrian uprising in the strict causal sense stops here. There is no mechanical formula to explain the Syrian uprising or any sort of revolution for that matter. But we can take stock of the multitude of developments that increased mass social discontent, especially those that impinged and further delimited the future prospects of Syrians as a whole, not least the bulging youth demographic. And no, this is not a claim about the singularity of the youth explanation of the uprising, as we discussed last week, for instance, here. Simply another important stack of hay that provided fodder for rebellion. The youth explanation, the social media explanation, and other spurious explanations are inadequate at best. The setting, the causal setting, if you will, or lens is much more complex and much more of a constellation of factors that ultimately affected or created an issue of dignity, and that is something that requires more profound treatment. Nonetheless, not all development factors or events are equal in helping us understand a political setting, much less its rupture. The socioeconomic and socio-political foundation of a regime provides us with a structural insight or window for the organization of life in a particular context. In short, the regime's shifting of social and political alliances started in the 1980s from labor towards social and political forms of capital, mainly for the purpose of regime security, resilience, and continuity, which spoke of a future that would inevitably leave Syria and Syrians behind. While so much else was also transpiring during 3 decades before 2011, the most consistent defining character of Syria's political economic development since was this emergent new nexus of power between political power and capital. And that shift between leftist alliances or left/populist alliances to more right-wing business alliances is something that is not particular to Syria. It is an indication or usually a trajectory that post-colonial development follows in at least non-rentier states. This sociopolitical alliance between power and capital, limited and constrained as it was, ultimately undermined Syria's modest productive power economically and disenfranchised the majority of Syrians who could not benefit from its promise. This promise was kept for the new elite participants among regime and business sectors amid the new facade of modernization erected mostly in Syrian metropolitan cities. It is a cliche, to be sure, but only the rich got richer. Incidentally, this rift between a new social reality in Syria and the growing number of Syrians deprived of their entitlements, even if meager under the previous redistributive formulas of a dominant public sector, set this rift, set the stage for a two-decade-long staring, not sharing. This rift set the stage for a two-decade-long staring at a good life getting away from most Syrians. If this is the wider context for various other developments in Syria since the late 1980s, the factor that exacerbated its deleterious effects on the everyday experience of Syrians is the increasingly incompetent and corrupt mismanagement of political, social, economic, and infrastructural institutions in the country. In addition to other factors and developments that affect Syria's or Syrians' lives at the time, what you get by the early to mid 2000s is a ticking bomb in the making. And though it was on no one's mind that it would explode within a decade at the time, it was still the writing on the wall. This much I tried to convey in my first book on Syria under the title Business Networks, the Political Economy of Regime Resilience, which addresses essentially the costs Syria and Syrians paid for the preservation of the regime, of the Syrian regime that Hafiz al-Assad took over and built in his own image starting in 1970. However, if we are to understand the more immediate or relatively recent roots of the uprising, we must look at the culmination of Assad's political economic strategy, which unfolded further after his death in 2000. Bashar al-Assad inherited his father's role and development strategy of circumscribed or limited liberalization, and once he consolidated support around him, proceeded to narrow down further this circle of beneficiaries and reward the closest family members instead, or most loyal partners. Simultaneously, the regime deepened its neoliberal-like policies to better secure Syria's position within the regional and international economic environment. Both these measures, which are more or less features of neoliberal development elsewhere, led to a sharp increase in social and economic polarization as the state's economic liberalization measures continued to further undermine the public sector and the Ba'ath Party's base without sufficiently replacing them with a competent private sector engine on the one hand, or an alternative social base on the other. The theme of Bashar's deepening of reforms was modernization, to avoid making reformist or democratist declarations. This attempt at modernization from above further eroded the regime's domestic legitimacy among ordinary Syrians, but bolstered it across privileged individuals, networks, and classes. With time, the emergence to prominence and power of a new generation of Ba'athist and business community offspring exacerbated the gap between social classes in Syria, not least because of their ostentatious exhibition of wealth and opulence. It is important to note that Bashar's policies here were a continuation of his father's and differed not in kind, but rather in degree in terms of the number of policies and expansion of sectors affected. In terms of actual policies, the establishment in 2005 of what was called a social market economy, a dubious term to be sure, legitimized and accelerated the transformation towards a market-oriented economy, as in that direction. These measures included investment liberalization, counter land reforms, a new private banking system, price deregulation, the establishing of private sector-led monetary policy, and the emergence of new private holding companies that became the symbol of these changes. These policies combined with a devastating drought and subsidy cuts to foment increased mass discontent over the decade prior to 2011. Even if often exaggerated by analysts, the drought caused increased migration from the countryside to already overwhelmed and underserved urban cities, and subsidy cuts on services, food, and other basic goods, and most importantly, oil and gas, left most Syrians in a far more vulnerable state economically, as these cuts, especially on oil subsidies, increased the prices of everything in sight. As the decade dragged on, the quality of basic services offered by the state dramatically declined. Subsidy cuts led to a sharp increase in the cost of living, while salaries stagnated. Cheap imported goods hurt small manufacturers all over Syria, notably in the working class towns around Damascus. And in rural areas, hardships brought on by economic changes were compounded by the effects of a brutal drought, particularly in the south and the northeast. Furthermore, years of neglect of the countryside prompted an exodus of underprivileged Syrians to rare hubs of economic activity. Cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs saw the development of sprawling suburbs that absorbed rural migrants, but often were devoid of adequate services and amenities. Members of the state-employed middle class, caught between, on the one hand, low salaries, shrinking subsidies and services, and on the other, rising expenses, were pushed out of the city center towards the capital's underdeveloped outskirts. Some of these are quotes and paraphrasing of a number of readings I've been doing. I can provide any and all sources later. Meanwhile, the city glitter, new urban shops and cafes, and commodity opulence that was on daily exhibit and display was only reinforcing the shape of things to come in Syria amid continued frustration and discontent on the one hand, and few, if any, responsive institutional avenues for redress on the other. There was no way to speak out, to voice concerns or protest, no way that is legitimate, and certainly not collective. To be sure, Syrians were still not yet ready to go to the streets, and evidently did not before 2011. Not for a shortage of reasons. There are plenty of reasons to go to the streets many years before 2011, but perhaps for a lack of an opportunity to do so with some expectation of success. In many ways, this was bound up with a myriad of collective action and communication obstacles. The neighboring Arab uprisings changed this calculus gradually, starting with those most affected by changes in recent years, if not decades. These social strata hailed primarily from the countryside or smaller towns and cities, and had a lot less to lose while being less proximate to the centers of power and the mecca of coercive apparatuses. I will have to skip over some of the aspects that contributed to the increased mass discontent in Syria in the decade prior to the uprising, but these were always in the background of the aforementioned developments. Notably here, I'm referring mainly to the state of public institutions in Syria, a state of affairs that exacerbated existing problems and crises across the board. I'll move to the dynamics and transformation of the uprising and try to get to a point where maybe I'll leave some more room for discussion based on what seems to be of concern to everyone here. In all cases, my current research examines the intersection between this trajectory of the Arab uprising moment, which itself gave rise to the Syrian uprising, perhaps somewhat prematurely. And I say prematurely, not in a flippant way, but analytically. Even if the situation was dire for most Syrians, they were not about to spontaneously, as I suggested, swarm the streets independently of this demonstration effect in 2010, in December 2010, when Bouazizi immolated himself. In contrast, protests in Egypt, as an example, did not abate during the 5 or 8 years prior to its own uprising. I was in Egypt in 2004, for instance, and I was filming various interviews, and then I found myself not filming interviews, but filming protests, workers' protests, and other civilian protests throughout the streets of Cairo. So that situation continued from 2004 all the way to the eruption of the uprising on January 2011 in Cairo, in Egypt. Well, actually didn't start in Cairo, but ended up being in Cairo. In the case of Syria, this was unheard of, the sort of collective organizing and exhibition of mass protests prior to 2011, with very few exceptions that usually were either state-sponsored or were state-sponsored, but people took advantage of that situation being state-sponsored and kind of like made the most out of it to express other concerns. Speaking about a complex set of events such as a revolution is always tricky because of the multitude of factors, actors, geographies, narratives, trajectories, and discourses involved. However, to make sense of the outcomes that millions now have to live with, we can't just stand on the sidelines and give up, even if our approach is iterative, even if we basically would like to slowly, carefully move forward to understand and maybe try here and there to explain certain developments. But I'd like to stick with the word understand, because that, if we could understand something, I think we're in good shape. Explaining things can actually be a very ambitious goal in most cases. This complexity in Syria cannot paralyze us into saying nothing, right? I mean, you can address a complex case or the complexity of case as much as you like, but if the complexity paralyzes you, then there's something that is lacking. And one way of trying to address these matters is literally not to jettison important factors and bring all factors to bear. And when in doubt, address alternative explanations or alternative narratives to what you're suggesting, which I try to do in my work as much as possible. This complexity, in the end, has to be confronted by being reasonably simplified with evidence-based approaches and plenty of corroboration, given the geographic and political restrictions, as well as the information and media blackout that animated developments in Syria after 2011. So that's a very important note on being prudent in addressing any narrative or explanation regarding the developments in a complex case, and acknowledging the existence of other narratives, largely because, not just because of the social scientific endeavor and its limitations, but also because of the limitation of the actual field of operations, field of developments in Syria, and the difficulty in accessing it. Even if we lived in Syria at the time, it was difficult to understand precisely what is going on elsewhere. You might as well be living in Copenhagen, because some areas were off limits to even existing researchers at the time. While reasons for revolt in Syria abound, given the dire state of affairs described here and elsewhere, many Syrians had other reasons to hesitate joining the uprising early on. That's why the uprising in Syria was a bit more gradual than in some other cases. It was not just the threat of brutal reprisal by the regime that caused the hesitation, a regime whose toolbox is dominated by only such approaches for the most part. It was also a set of considerations about likely alternatives to the regime based on the positionality of different groups and their calculation of trade-offs. These groups included most upper classes. These are the ones who hesitated more than the rest and majority of the Syrian population. These groups included most upper classes who still were split on the matter. And even if they were opposed, they were a bit silent about it early on, hedging their bets, not knowing whether this uprising will be crushed in short order and then have them be the next victims. Most minorities were also hedging their bets, and those benefiting directly or indirectly from the regime, either because they have common political or economic interests, like its business partners, or those who are part of the vast regime, administrative, governmental, coercive institutions, both formally and informally. These are the networks of the regime, both familial and institutional, that actually naturally did not join the opposition. But there was enough hesitation to space out the spread of the revolution throughout Syria, with the major metropolitan cities being spared or early on, but then of course they were penetrated, especially in Aleppo, within a couple of years. This lack of opposition homogeneity, not only of opposition, but of readiness and intensity of commitment regarding collective protest, complicated matters for a revolutionary project that soon fell hostage to the dynamics of regional and global politics, as much as people continued to be steadfastly for radical change in Syria. These dynamics were activated based on Syria's pivotal role in the region and its location at the intersection of several emergent or endemic conflicts, including the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Iran-Saudi Arabian standoff, the inflated but eventually real Sunni-Shi'i divide, and the broader struggles pitting self-styled forces of anti-Western imperialism, of which Syria and Iran form the nucleus, against the more conservative monarchies and other allies of Western powers, led by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and ostensibly Qatar. Qatar. Turkey, who had until the 11th hour been forging business deals with the Syrian government and businesses, had its own concern with potential Kurdish insurrection and autonomy south of its borders, causing it to intervene quickly and manipulate aspects of the uprising for its own purposes, as did almost every single external actor supporting either the opposition or the regime. To be sure, both Saudi Arabia and Qatar had also supported the regime directly and indirectly for decades prior to the uprising and up to the last minute before the mass protests. Everyone, therefore, on the side of the regime, but especially on the side of the opposition, saw the Syrian uprising not as a righteous rebellion against decades of oppression and exploitation, but as an opportunity to draw the political map of the region to suit their own interests, with, of course, all along the Syrian citizen, average, ordinary, regular citizen being the ultimate victim. Finally, the advent of foreign fighters not only complicated matters, but introduced an additional factor that was instrumentalized by external actors in the hopes of quickly overpowering the regime's hands and the hands of its allies. I say quickly because the ideology and goals of these foreign fighters, for instance, who, to be sure, found common cause with some of the local groups that have been brutalized by the regime during the uprising, their ideology did not comport with those of their external backers. And it certainly did not comport with the overwhelming majority of Syrians who took this to the streets. This ideology, the totalitarian ideology, is a totalitarian Islamist one. Not that all Islamist ideologies are totalitarian, but this one, espoused by most of the foreign fighters, was with an express goal of establishing a theocratic state, a goal that is not quite popular at all with the majority of Syrians, even if many would go for a more conservative state. The full scale of such external penetration and involvement had several consequential effects that shaped and in many cases determined the fate either of strands of the uprising or ultimately of the uprising itself. First, it thwarted the trajectory of the revolutionary project in a far less democratic direction as the local conflict became more responsive to external pressures, or because simply the dramatic increase in weaponization and violence overcrowded anything else, including the civilian opposition, which we stopped seeing beginning sometime in 2012 in any form that's resembled the earlier days or year and a half prior. Second, profound external intervention strengthened counter-revolutionary currents on both sides. On the regime's side, the eventual intervention on the regime's side by Iran, Hezbollah, and later Russia prevented a regime collapse. On the opposition's side, external intervention by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and the United States strengthened the militant aspect of the uprising for instrumental purposes at the expense of the civilian aspects, even if they, quote unquote, say they did not intend to do so. The reason this happened is because they assumed that the fall of the regime would be quick, after which they can take care of cleaning up the mess of, quote unquote, jihadists. But that did not happen, of course, and they had a Frankenstein on their hands, on their collective hands, which explained to a large degree the hesitation we saw within the United States after the gas attack in the suburbs of Damascus in August 2013, which also explains the hesitation and more careful support and funding by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, all of which came out in 2017 after the cessation of the most dominant hostilities. It came out in 2017 when Qatar and Saudi Arabia basically had a major dispute over who radicalized, Islamicized, weaponized the uprising. And those discussions are online. It's beautiful to watch them because the things we were trying to get at without solid evidence in 2013, for instance, or 14, were on display online from the horse's mouth, saying things that incriminated either themselves or each other. The consequence was counter-revolutionary of both of these interventions on the side of the regime and the opposition, because the militant rebels had goals that were different from the original sentiments, motivations, and goals that animated the start of the Syrian uprising. So the consequences were counter-revolutionary. I'm referring to the intervention alongside the opposition and the flow of freedom fighters was counter-revolutionary because what ended up emerging as the spearhead of the fighting force on the ground within the opposition, the goals of these groups, of these rebels, of these fighters, of these, call them what you like, revolutionaries even, were at odds with the goals of the people that swarmed the streets in millions early on during the Syrian uprising. Now, on the side of the supporters of the regime, none of the supporters of the regime claim that they are a bastion of democracy, certainly not Iran or Hezbollah or Russia, right? So the question is different there. They purposefully and openly intervened to prevent the regime from collapsing, a regime that is repressive, authoritarian, exploitative, and so on. So the lack of hypocrisy there is not a plus. It's just basically the way things are when you're trying to prop up an authoritarian regime. In some, the Syrian uprising was gradually transformed from a struggle for democracy and the end of tyranny to a regional and international affair that culminated in an all-out war, proxy or otherwise, call it a civil war, call it an all-out conflict, all-out war, but it was transformed from this struggle for democracy to something else. And there's so much debate as to what to call this something else. But a proxy war is usually something that is more innocuous and is used often. In all cases, the majority of the Syrian people were the victims of this transformation, and so was the revolutionary project itself, a project that many of us tried to warn is going off the rails. And unfortunately, the desire to remove this repressive regime was often stronger than the sobriety it should have taken, or must have taken, or could have taken to sort of hit the brakes on supporting a direction that was almost inevitably likely to undermine the revolution itself, not least after the Russian intervention in 2015 took place. In fact, the Russian military intervention in 2015 was quite decisive. And by late 2016, early 2017, the major hostilities had given way to more local struggles and conflicts, as well as various attempts by most actors to de-escalate and demarcate lines of geographic and political authority so as to keep the peace when it became obvious, not that the revolution is over, especially in the hearts and minds of people, but to basically recognize that regime collapse, as was suggested or hoped for after the takeover of the entire city of Aleppo by the regime with support from its allies, became less and less likely a goal, given the metropolitan cities were now all firmly under the control of the Syrian regime and its allies. Finally, the dynamics of the uprising involved the development of the war economy, from which all parties benefited literally on all sides. As the war economy replaced the dwindling national economy, we saw warlords become business moguls, and some business moguls venture further into politics, not least after the dominant hostilities settled in previous years. One significant overall effect of the war economy was the prolonging of the conflict, given all parties were benefiting in a context where a solution seemed intractable. I won't say more about the war economy here, but it's a major part of my research, and it will actually figure prominently in the book because it became one of the topics around which so much of the dynamics of the Syrian uprising can be understood. The last point I want to make is going back to the point that I made at the outset, which is we now find that ardent supporters of the regime have actually changed their position in terms of who they would like to blame today for the state of affairs. And even though this is not a ubiquitous all-out outcry against the regime by former supporters, we do have enough research to suggest that the folks that either were on the sidelines, supported the regime for the lesser evil, based on the lesser evil logic, or even those who supported the regime because they felt it protected them, whatever the reason was, a good number of Syrians are now living miserable lives to which they attribute to the regime's mismanagement and failed promises. The reason I wanted to finish with this is because in every single article in which I wrote about the future during the uprising, I emphasized the importance of a future where a Syrian opposition, which does not have to be perfect, but it just cannot be moving in a direction that undermines the very goals of the revolution, which is sort of what happened after 2013, in particular in Syria. But any sort of opposition in the future in Syria needs to be democratic, independent, and inclusive, which the opposition unfortunately was not. And in many ways, many of us failed to point this out very early on when we began to see the anti-democratic trends within the opposition, especially the external one, when we began to see the more exclusive approach to who can be part of the official opposition, because those parties that were not in line with Qatari, Saudi, or American politics were not necessarily invited or basically welcomed within this opposition. And therefore, the question of independence was from the very beginning quite concerning, given that the sponsors of the opposition were states that, as I shared, whether it's Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or the United States, were in so many ways not fit or qualified to support democratic movements in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the region, for many reasons that history attests to more than one can actually repeat in a short period of time. So hopefully the next round in the case of Syria will involve these qualities of democracy, inclusiveness, and independence, and hopefully the heterogeneity that we witnessed in terms of the opposition or in terms of the Syrian social landscape will become more homogeneous in moving forward to demand radical change in Syria without even I should say poison of international involvement, which always tends to strengthen the hands of the hardliners and usually undermines democratic movements. And I hope that what's happening in Iran today, for instance, given that it is happening today, continues to grow in a manner that doesn't fall into these traps. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for this very passionate and action-oriented speech. And I'm very much looking forward to the book with the war economy. This is also one of my favorite topics, so I'm looking forward to that. But for now, we will have a Q&A. If Professor Haddad, you would graciously agree with that. What would happen is that I would call Matthew Piero, who is in our class, to have a reflection, perhaps not on everything what you have said, but we would like to perhaps take you a little bit back to the 90s and 2000s as well, because as I said, we read your chapter, especially the what you called circumscribed liberalization in the 90s, which continued, as you said, under Bashar. So I don't know if Matthew, do you want to jump in and pose your reflection? Thanks. And then we will call other questions and comments, and hopefully you will answer some questions from the external audience as well.
Okay, so hi.
No, Matthew, our microphone is there.
Oh,
actually, okay. I think Professor Haddad can hear you, just use your computer. Okay. I know it's straight.
So hi, Professor Haddad. So thank you for being with us today and for your talk on factors leading up to the uprising in Syria. So as Professor Messine said, I wanted to bring us back to the chapter of your book that we had read, the political dynamics of economic liberalization in Syria, and your examination of the emerging private wealth in Syria in the 1990s. You had posed a question early on in that chapter that I was curious about. You asked, how has this new private wealth been prevented from being transformed into political power? And I think you discussed this at several points, identifying the macroeconomic control the government had, their risk-averse behavior, their manipulation of the role of law, and the fact that many of these newly wealthy elites in Syria were well-connected and sometimes related to the regime. But that said, I was hoping you could expand on this question as to why collective action among this class of new wealth did not seem to materialize in a more meaningful way.
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. This is actually the heart of the matter, as a political economist by the name of John Waterbury called it in his article, Twilight of the State Bourgeoisie in 1991, I think. So this is the heart of the matter, which is essentially that the regime, just like any other authoritarian regime that would like to shift alliances in order to bolster its generation of foreign exchange and jobs and so on, the manner in which the Syrian regime was able to basically benefit from the wealth of the business community without allowing this to become a threat, or without allowing this wealth to actually be transformed into political power, is simply by dividing the business community at the top layers specifically, by providing differential privileges. So not all parts of the business community were invited to join these coalitions or networks with the regime, only parts of them. And that division that took place in terms of preferred business partners that were also based on a set of criteria that privileged or prioritized loyalty and the lack of ambition for a political career or a political project. This division within the business class that the regime embarked upon simply prevented collective action on part of the business community as a whole, especially the most powerful aspects of them. So that's where most of the answer lies in terms of how the how private wealth was prevented from being transformed into political power. Dividing the business community to prevent collective action first, and second, the very peculiar legal system in Syria, especially regarding economic activity, whereby there exists a set of layers of laws and regulations dating back to the Ottoman Empire, the French colonial period, the early post-independence period, the United Arab Republic period with the union with Egypt that lasted 3 years, the what is called the coup, the liberal coup, basically, that took place in 61 to 63, where the old guard, the old liberal guard, came back to power. And then, of course, the Ba'athist period from 63 to 70. And then, of course, when Assad took over from 70 until 1990, at least, these are about 6 or 7 or 8 legal frameworks that governed economic activity. The Syrian state left most of them intact, which meant that every single economic activity can actually put you in the illegal realm. So by law, you could be arrested for and that was subject to the whims and exegetical decision of the regime. So combination of a divide and conquer, the use of legality, and ultimately the threat of brutal force made sure that these centers of wealth were not transformed into centers of power. And to be honest, violence was not used in these respects as much as the other aspects that I shared. So that is something that animated the 1990s and 2000s. And by the time basically the capital, the if you will, the fixed capital that was accumulated as part of the business community or as part of the private-public partnerships between officials and business people, this amount of fixed capital by the mid-1990s outgrew the fixed capital that was being produced within the public sector in Syria. And despite a lot of analysts' insistence that the state was still the party that had the upper hand, and I don't dispute that the state didn't have the upper hand, but decisions to knock down the enterprise of state capitalism was no longer as easily made, because you would be shooting yourself in the foot. So in many ways, the calculus changed, the breakdown value changed between the state and the business community. And when I say business community, I don't just mean people who are private business people. I also mean people who are part of the state, who have either themselves or offspring or family members within the business community, either separately from a state or officials alliances, or in partnership with state officials. This newfound capital began to carry gravity and did not need to lobby the state for more expansion of sectors that are open to private business, or for deregulation that private business would benefit from. The decision became rational for the state to make under Hafiz Assad in the later part of the 1990s, and more so under Bashar Assad, especially after 2003, after the new Bashar-led regime was able to consolidate itself and embark on all sorts of changes that I discussed. I hope that satisfied your question.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I don't know. Are we on? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Okay. So thank you so much. Yeah, Matthew I hope the answer was quite good, right?
Yes, that's perfect.
So we have a number of other questions. I don't know. I would like to ask. I don't know. In the class, do you have guys questions, or someone would pose one? No.
I have one.
Clara. Yalla. You can.
Hi, Adam. Hello. Sorry, just want to jump in and say hi. I need to pick up my daughter. I'm Bassam Zeno. I will be your guest like in a few weeks. And Bassam is my brother, and Yeah, and a great, always great. Like I'm meeting with Bassam every week, so thank you, Bassam. We'll have many questions like in our meeting, but just want to say hi, fascinating student like discussions and questions. Looking forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Professor Zeno. See you very soon in 2 weeks. Thank you for jumping in. So we have actually a question from Clara Harms. Clara, you want to pose your question or?
Sure, I typed it in the chat, but my question is basically in the 90s and in the 2000s, as the government is pushing for more capitalism, more disenfranchising, like, does that also translate to the privatization of health or education or other public sectors? And why or why not, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because health was not privatized as a matter of state decision, but private health-oriented institutions sprang up and became quite popular for those who had the capital, not because public health was actually not offered, or freer healthcare was not offered in most cases, but because the quality of free healthcare had deteriorated so much that people would actually save up money for basically whatever ailment they have, to be able to afford private healthcare. And that is, of course, the state of affairs that I was sharing in terms of the deteriorating institutions in Syria, the public institutions in Syria. One of them is healthcare. Education was not privatized either, except that the same development took place where private education institutions emerged, and they attracted those with capital. But for most Syrians, they continued to attend the free educational system all the way up to college, as well as most Syrians also continued to have subsidized healthcare, especially those working in the public sector, because they can't afford anything else. And that, of course, healthcare is a sensitive issue, not just in Syria, but also in the United States. But in the case of Syria, there hasn't been a decision to deprive Syrian citizens or public sector workers from free healthcare or free education.
Thank you. Thanks, Clara. I myself would pose one question, if I may, and together with the question of Eve Duffy, who is actually our director of Middle East Studies Center and provost for global affairs. And I would like to connect my question to her question, because she put in the chat that when you discuss the vision of the business class from the 90s onwards, she posted this question and said, so from a Marxist perspective, there was a missing working class, and the leap into the neoliberalism directly was somehow one of the root causes of the present calamity. And I would add to this that the question whether, so you mentioned the revolutionary project in 2011 that in your interpretation was hijacked. So was there a revolutionary project really in 2011? And what were the features of that? Was that in a Marxist center revolutionary project? So that was a workers' or some was from social justice as well. Were there actual workers involved? What do we know about the working class indeed in 2000s in Syria?
Okay, thank you. This is very important, and the question might surprise you because there isn't there wasn't any sort of mass mobilization of workers in Syria, because there wasn't any sort of mass mobilization of any group in Syria to begin with. So the revolutionary project simply refers to the fact that with time, after the emergence of the first set of protests in March 2011, you began to see Syrians, most Syrians, especially those who could actually go out to the streets, go to the streets and express their interests in change. Of course, they didn't start first with calling for an overthrow of the regime, like in Dir'a in south of Syria. They started by calling for the end of corruption. As a result of the cycle of repression and protests and the more brutal handling by the regime of the protests in Dir'a, the demands were transformed from being reformatory to being revolutionary. As a result, this trajectory of protests in certain parts of southern Syria spread all over. And in a sense, yes, this was a revolutionary project. It didn't have to have a manifesto. It didn't have to be a working class project, because working class people, for the most part, were part of the uprisings. In fact, they actually in many ways were dominant players, especially in rural areas where almost by definition they were the underprivileged, but not necessarily organized working class. So if we're talking from a Marxist perspective, looking for an organized labor union or an organized working class, you're not going to see that in Egypt and Syria. You did see it to an extent in Egypt, and they did actually have an impact. You will probably see it in Iran, and it will probably have an impact. In the case of Syria, the level of social and political repression was such that such convenings were not likely to take place. And especially labor within the public sector in Syria, historically, more so than recently, of course, was more privileged than other members of society, even of the middle class, because of the privileges that were afforded to them by the state welfare policies. Of course, that has dwindled and deteriorated and now is in a horrendous state. But historically, there isn't a working class movement that would qualify for a Marxist type revolutionary vanguard. But in all other aspects, and if you decouple, working class collective mobilization from people that belong to the working class, yes, we had an overwhelming majority of Syrians wanting change, especially early on. Even early on, as in during the first few months, some people say the first year and a half or so, where there was a consensus that radical change was needed. But that consensus also, even early on, even within the first year, began to be slowly chipped at by the emergence of various forces inside and outside Syria that basically ended up using these protests and mobilizations for their own purposes, which happens in all situations. The difference is that the level of penetration and the level of external involvement, especially during the first 2 weeks in Syria, began to thwart the direction of the uprising. And that's where the debates took place as to how much did that thwart the direction of the uprising, and whether we should just support it regardless, because there's no other way to remove other than pushing for militancy, even if the militancy is populated by people, groups, and ideologies that are antithetical to the revolution. So this is where a lot of the discussion and debates have been. And this is where the poisonous climate of Syria discourse, the reputation for poisonous climate came from. And many of us were targets of that, being called regime sympathizers, simply because we were critical of the direction that some of the rebel groups were taking the uprising in, and so on. So yes, there was a collective desire for radical change. And yes, it was supported early on by people inside and outside Syria that later on changed their minds. But early on, yes, there was a euphoria of sorts. and it's very difficult to determine the moment where that euphoria gave way to something else. So no, I don't think we should be too concerned about the lack of a Marxist oriented organized working class. However, it is important to share that that might be the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask, if we are looking at ways to shed doubt on the uprising, and there are many other ways to shed doubt on the uprising, especially later on, but early on, I think the more appropriate question to ask is, what did the regime do to bolster and support a workers' labor union, a life for workers and laborers that is dignified by after the 1980s, where there was a modicum of that. For the 20 years prior to the uprising, it is the regime that first and foremost undermined every single aspect of labor unions, worker solidarity, peasant solidarity, countryside development, and so on. So I think the opposite question should be asked from a Marxist perspective, for those people who are using a Marxist tool or tools and categories, analytical tools and categories, to basically look at the uprising. It's not any better within the state, even especially that the state actually promoted the exact opposite of worker solidarity starting in the late 80s and early 1990s, and went all the way in that direction in the 2000s, after 2003 and 4 under Bashar al-Assad. So yeah, there's nothing to look back at and wonder whether it harmed any sort of Marxist sensibilities. Every party involved was not focused on that, and it was almost very difficult for the uprising to organize on these bases. This is not, it's not Finland.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a fascinating answer. I mean, we can, of course, in a one-party socialist state, the question of workers is always very interesting. For instance, China, right, as well. I don't know, Professor Haddad, would you answer a last question, perhaps a little bit provocative? I see in the chat from Mel Lehman, who says that I visited Syria as a humanitarian worker in 2018. I repeatedly heard that it was not a civil war, but rather a proxy war in which the US and the West fueled extremists trying to take down the government. But after 10 years, the Syrian people stood by Mr. Assad. Please comment. Mel Lehman. Do you want to answer this?
Very quickly. I mean, whenever you hear the word, the Syrian people stood by Assad after this calamity of more than 350 to 400,000 people being killed, not all by the regime, but the majority were by the regime and its allies, it's almost, it's almost difficult to comprehend comments of the sort, not because, there aren't people who are saying, what we just heard, but largely because even the people that supported the regime during the uprising, they did not support it because of love of the regime or support for the regime directly. They supported the regime because, or most people support the regime because of the fear of an alternative, the fear of a life where they would be under the exact same type of repression, plus social and cultural repression in addition to that, given the direction of the uprising. And for the most part, even in the best of times, the majority of the Syrian people have been actually brutalized economically or socially or politically by the regime. I mean, not all three at a time, but in one sense or another, the majority of the people have been excommunicated, disenfranchised by the regime by 2010 and 11. And even though the direction of the uprising and the external intervention that transformed the uprising into something else, yes, by then the uprising itself was not necessarily going the right direction, and the uprising became a topic of debate, but never did the nature of the Syrian regime become a topic of debate. Those who say that are strict supporters of the regime, not on strategic grounds, but on substantive grounds. Even the supporters of the regime understand the regime is really problematic, but they just don't want another alternative. So at no point was the nature of the regime being discussed as something that you should stand by or not stand by for substantive reason. It simply was a situation where the uprising itself was not serving the goals that it emerged to serve, and it frankly allowed the uprising itself to eat itself, to damage itself, and thereby unintentionally giving the upper hand to the regime and its allies. That position is very different from saying that the regime, people stood with the regime. Yes, the regime ended up not collapsing, but even in this lack of collapse, it's a decrepit state of affairs that even the supporters of the regime are now antagonizing. And if we keep saying, like we did under different circumstances in the recent past, that people stood with dictatorships like the Syrian dictatorship, and we're talking about majorities, if we are saying that, I think we need to do a little bit more on the ground research. I've done that for 16 years in Syria until January 2011. I'm not allowed in Syria anymore. And nobody got this impression. You could be on the side or support the regime for other purposes, such as the regime's stance on Israel or on the United States hegemony in the region, or its partnership with Iran against the more conservative monarchies in the region. You could stand with the regime, but you cannot claim that the Syrian people stood with the regime at any point in time, if you mean by Syrian people, most Syrians. It's just not something that that will carry water.